Hi, and welcome to today's virtual program with Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. I'm Kelly Corrigan. I'm a New York Times bestselling author and the host of KQED's Exactly podcast. I am super pleased to be in conversation with Katherine Schwarzenegger Pratt, who is also a New York Times bestselling author, here to talk about her new book, The Gift of Forgiveness. Thanks for joining us from
Thank you
LA.
for having me.
Uh, Guys who are watching, you can ask questions at any time during this. Someone from the Commonwealth Club is going to pull them together for me and shoot them over when the time is right. The way to ask a question is if you're watching on YouTube, use chat. And if you're watching on Facebook, use comments. Okay, so I have 45 minutes where I get to ask you anything I want. And then we'll open it up to everybody else for 15 minutes, and then we'll have to
Great.
wrap it up.
Wonderful.
So this is the book. It's called The Gift of Forgiveness.
Mhm.
And it's such a worthy and rewarding and self-reinforcing project to study
Yeah.
forgiveness the way you
Mhm.
have. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about all the forgiveness that is required in the course of even just a very typical life, which you've met people in here who have had incredibly atypical experiences. But all of us over time have to forgive institutions, and we have to forgive strangers, and we have to forgive our closest relatives for trivial things and true tragedies. We have to forgive people who are deranged, and who cause nearly unspeakable suffering in our lives. And so, but the book starts on a really familiar note. And as a former teenage girl and now the mother of two teenage girls, I will just flag for everyone that there is an intensity to women's friendships that can make betrayal Shakespearean.
Yeah.
So that's where the book begins. Will you tell us a little bit about the inciting event?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and thank you for doing this. This is really fun and a great and creative way um, to stay connected and do fun events like this while we're all sitting at home in quarantine.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
thank you.
I'm delighted.
Um, I started the book telling a story about a falling out that I had with one of my best friends at the time, and just to kind of explain my reason for doing a deep dive into forgiveness in general, because one of the most common questions I always get is why forgiveness, and that's such a crazy topic to want to tackle. And so I had a really big falling out with one of my close girlfriends that I think, as you were saying, as someone who it seems to be a big women's issue. I know that men also have falling outs with their friendships, but from what I've gathered with talking about this book, my prep for this book is that women really can relate to this topic of falling out with a best friend, because I think a lot of us create these friendships when we're very young that we look at as history friendships, and you kind of paint this picture for yourself of going to college together and, being in each other's weddings, having babies together, living on the same block, and just being a part of each other's lives forever. And then when that doesn't go as planned, or when something, big happens, betrayal, whatever it is that causes a rupture in a friendship, it can be a very traumatic event. And I think with the 22 people's stories that are in this book, falling out with a friendship sounds so trivial and silly. But when I was going through it, it felt very, very real and very serious, and really hard, and required a huge amount of effort and also grief. And it was a very strange thing to go through. And I felt like I was really struggling with forgiveness. And I know that I had struggled with forgiveness before that, but it was really that falling out that sparked my interest in forgiveness, because I realized that I didn't know what forgiveness meant to me in my life and how to practice it. And I hadn't really had any situation where I wanted so desperately to move on and to forgive, and I just did not know what it meant. And I think most of us learn what forgiveness is when we're very little and on the playground, and it's very simple. And then we don't really address what it means when you're 15 or when you're 20 and 25 and 30 and as you get older, and it changes. And I hadn't really taken a moment to figure out what it meant to me and also how I practiced it and had I even practiced it before. So I did a big deep dive into forgiveness, really just out of interest and curiosity on ways to help myself navigate my way through my forgiveness journey. And I went to churches, I went to therapy, I talked to a lot of different people, and I found that the most helpful information came really from talking to other people about their forgiveness journeys and their struggles. And some people who experienced forgiveness very easily and quickly, other people who struggled with it for a very long time. And I felt like using their nuggets of wisdom and their stories and applying it to my own life was the most helpful, and it really dramatically helped me and inspired me in my forgiveness journey with a former best friend. And so I wanted to put it in book format, and that's kind of why I start the book off that way.
Well, I definitely don't think it's trivial to have a falling out. Like, I
Thank you.
think that like women's friendships can be like a cornerstone experience of a lifetime. I mean,
Right.
I bet your mom would say, and your grandma would have said
Yeah.
that these women, you do get super attached. And then when there's a rupture, it can be insanely distracting. Like you
Yeah.
can be looping. Like I always think about it as like the tape is looping, and I
Hmm.
can't stop reliving the moment or thinking of different things I could have said
Right.
or fantasizing about reuniting or ripping someone's head off or like all the different emotions, like I play them out in my mind, and our mind share is deeply limited.
Yeah.
There are only so many things at any given moment that we can be devoted to. And
Hmm.
so to have one of the pieces of the pie devoted to anger and frustration and reliving and reapproaching a single incident is to give up a lot of your energy and power and potential for productive work.
Yeah. I mean, I really felt that, in this particular situation, I would be really upset about it, say I was over it. And then when I would run into the person, I would have a huge amount of anxiety and stress. And I felt it in my body. And so it was really a desire to eliminate that from my life and from just my existence, and the anxiety of, like, what's going to happen if we run into each other, what's going to happen if someone brings up, the name. And it's just, I think that, as
Consume.
women, yeah, it can be, it's something that we can stay in for a very long time. And it can also be something where, for me, I just felt like I did not want that to be part of my life anymore. And after a couple of years of it, was just like, this is something that I need to fix. And that's, why I wanted to
Dig.
dive headfirst into forgiveness.
Well, forgiveness, like the word is kind of bandied about, and we make our kids say we're sorry to one another,
Right.
so early in life that
Hmm.
they don't even, we're almost at the danger of making it flippant, where it's like, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
Hmm.
Like, I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
said I was sorry. And it's like,
Right.
that's not, you're not even close to the kind of depth that we're talking about. And so with real forgiveness, with it the word, in my opinion, should only apply to something that is extremely difficult to grant.
Hmm.
And so some of the people that you met with are just incredible. So there's 22 people in this book. It's a
Yeah.
really wide range. It must have been so fascinating and like personally enlarging. I mean, your heart must have grown like, you'll never be the same. You can't possibly be the same person after
No,
taking
definitely not.
books, which is so wonderful. Like, what a great book project to take on.
Yeah.
But there's four that I want to talk about before we have
Okay.
to share the stage with everybody who's watching. Um, So one was Nadia. So Nadia Bolz-Weber is a friend of mine. We've done a bunch of stuff together with the Nantucket Project.
Hmm.
And so tell everybody a little bit about Nadia and what you took away from talking to her.
Right. So just to backtrack a little bit, I interviewed 22 people for my book, just because I found so much help and wisdom from talking to other people about their different journeys with forgiveness, and just learning and very quickly that what forgiveness means to you is something completely different than what it means to me. And that's okay, and makes the topic of forgiveness that much more interesting and exciting, but also that much more challenging and daunting. And I loved being able to talk to different people, to be able to see that some people are able to practice forgiveness in an instant very easily, and
Mhm.
other people it takes 30 years, and some people it takes, they never get to that place, and it's something they deal with throughout their entire lives. And to know that there's no timetable on it, and there's only your way of practicing forgiveness. There's not a right or wrong way. And that was really eye opening for me in this journey of talking to 22 people. And as you've said, I definitely, my heart for sure grew in the process of talking to these 22 incredibly inspiring people. And um, and I learned so much about myself, and also just being so inspired and moved by all of these people's stories, because all of them are so different. One is completely different than the next, and my goal with that was really to be able to have a book that someone could pick up, see themselves in one person's story, or feel inspired to welcome forgiveness into their lives by one person's story. And also to not feel alone in their journey with forgiveness. And if I could accomplish that with one person, then this book will have served its purpose, because it's always my goal to be able to create something that will help other people just as it helped me in my journey. So when I first started to dive into forgiveness, I was doing a ton of different research on forgiveness, and reading, hundreds of stories that were so amazing, and coming up with a list of different people that I wanted to reach out to blindly. And that I reached out to all 22 of these people, not knowing any of them. And they were so gracious to let me talk to them. And all of them wanted to be a part of this book, because they wanted to help other people in their forgiveness journey, because they've been able to see what an impact forgiveness has had on their lives, and the importance of spreading awareness around it. And the message of forgiveness was really important to everybody. And when I was doing my research with forgiveness, my mom actually sent me a video that Nadia Bolz-Weber had created a couple years ago, that was called "Forgive A-Holes." I don't know if I can say that word
Uh-huh.
on here, but um, but I posted it recently because her and I did an Instagram live. But it's an incredible video, and the way my mom sent it to me, because she knew I was doing all this research on forgiveness, and for my book, and also just interested in forgiveness. And it's a great video. And so I watched her video, and the way that she talked about forgiveness changed everything for me. She talked about forgiveness in a way that I had not been spoken to about forgiveness. And the way that she talked about it was that forgiveness is a gift that you give yourself. It's not about giving somebody a gift of forgiveness. It's not about, giving anybody anything, or waiting for somebody to ask for something. It's about you as an individual saying what that person did, or people, was so wrong, that you no longer want it to be a part of your life moving forward. And to, kind of shut your eyes and imagine yourself taking bolt cutters to the chains that are attached to you of wrongs from your past, pains from your past, and cutting yourself free of them. And that is what forgiveness is. It is giving yourself the gift that says you no longer want to drag those things with you in your life moving forward, and you want to free yourself from those pains from your past. And when I thought of it like that, for the first time, I thought of forgiveness as being a really powerful and empowering
Uh-huh.
act, and not as a weakness or as a act of telling someone it's okay what you did, I forget, it's okay, like I'm not going to think about it, or giving somebody else a gift that they simply didn't deserve. And so I think for a lot of us, we grow up, or I can speak for myself, I grew up thinking sometimes that forgiveness was something that a weak person does, or sometimes it felt like if I forgive someone, it feels like a betrayal of my own hurt, and why would I give someone a gift if they just hurt my feelings or hurt me really deeply. And so watching Nadia's video on forgiveness really changed the way that I viewed forgiveness and made it seem for the first time like, wait a minute, forgiveness is about taking your power back, and is about you deciding that you no longer want a situation or a person to control your life moving forward, and you're making that decision on your own. And um, and so I reached out to Nadia blindly, and I asked her if she could talk more about that, and also her forgiveness journey, which she talks a huge amount about in general in her life and in her presence. But she talked about being in AA, and her sobriety and the forgiveness that goes on in that process. And there are obviously a huge amount of people who deal with addicts in their family, addicts in life in general, and it was really interesting to hear her take on forgiveness. And she was just such an inspiring and incredible person to
And
talk
such
to.
an
And
unusual messenger. So she's like 5'10",
yeah,
covered in tattoos, giant belt buckle, blood red lipstick, gap between her teeth, foul mouthed, so
yes.
articulate, pull down quotes from like 14 different sources in a single sentence,
Yeah.
like whip smart.
Uh-huh.
And so there's something about the way she expresses it that lets you hear it fresh, like it lets you hear it anew. But the thing that you just said that reminded me of the thing you put up front in the book, which was that this quote from Mark Nepo,
Mhm.
which this is what has kept me from forgiveness, the feeling that all I've been through will evaporate if I don't relive it. That if those who have hurt me don't see what they've done, my suffering will have been for nothing. And
Right.
what you're saying and what Nadia is saying is that you can set them aside. That the circle's much smaller. You're in your own relationship with resentment, and you're in your own relationship with forgiveness, and it may have very little in the end to do with the other person,
Yeah, I mean,
because
she also talks a lot about.
it's returning it to self.
Yes, exactly, and she talks a lot about the story that we tell ourselves, and sitting in that story and
Mhm.
spinning in that story, and reaching a point where you take accountability for whatever tiny little percentage you played or your part in a situation, and if it was absolutely no part, then that's okay as well. And just making the decision that you don't want to sit in that spiral anymore, and that staying in it is not a healthy situation for yourself and also for your desire to move forward. And so I think it's she says it in a really approachable and
Unusual.
welcoming way, like a relatable way, because you feel like you're sitting there talking to a pastor, but also a very relatable and
Yeah,
and interesting person. So
iconoclastic.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting to me about that storytelling thing. I really related to that because in our house, when you have little kids, you're always saying, like, beware of absolutes. Like, it's not always and never. Like, I don't never let you have ice cream, and I don't always side with your sister. And
Mhm.
it's not everyone and no one. It's not everyone is going to the party, or no one ever helps me with my work. And but when there's a wrong between two people, and then they separate and they go into their corners, and then they're just alone with their little unreliable narrator that they are,
Yeah.
and they're spinning up the story of what happened without
Mhm.
any incoming information from the other side now, because you've separated. And so you're like hardening around this story of the way it happened and who that person is, that is getting less and less nuanced and balanced with every day that you're investing alone in the creation and reinforcement of the story of how it went down. And
Right.
that can be so unhealthy because then you reconnect with the person. I mean, I had this in my own life where you reconnect with the person who you'd been sort of stewing on from a distance, and you think, "Oh, you're not that bad."
You're like, why was I mad again?
Yeah, like I mean, I know why I was mad, but like you're not like a monster. Like I
Yeah.
turned you into way more than
Yeah.
you. But in some cases in the book, I thought that the range of interviews you did was just so admirable and
Oh, thank you.
brave. I mean, you must have been shaking in your boots in some of these because these are such tender moments. So will you talk a little bit about Scarlett Lewis, who was the mom from Sandy Hook?
Yes. So Scarlett Lewis was uh, probably, I would say, one of the hardest interviews that I had done. And again, I reached out blindly to all of these people. So I didn't know if they would want to talk about forgiveness. It's, when you ask someone to talk about forgiveness, it's not the most exciting topic to talk about for most people. And it's oftentimes very challenging and requires a huge amount of vulnerability and just being really raw and open. And Scarlett was an interview that I was really nervous for because I had read her story, and her story is that um, she lost her 6-year-old son in the Sandy Hook shooting. And I did not know what to expect going into her interview. I'd read a little bit on her, but I just didn't know, how much she'd be willing to share with me. And she was so incredible. And I think we ended up talking for 2 hours just because the way that she spoke about losing her son and, uh, and getting to a place, losing her son, having anger, having sadness, um, dealing with the loss of her son, and also, the devastation and having something taken from you very quickly. And of course, a young child, which makes it insanely terrible. And also having another son at home who was his older brother, to try and balance that, and also herself. And and then
I thought
in
the way
addition.
you set up that scene of the older son looking at her and her feeling him watch her and
Mhm.
her maternal instinct that said, however I behave right now is going to mark him forever. I am
Right.
modeling for him. He will never forget how I do this. So
Mhm.
if I live the rest of my days full of hatred and vitriol and the wrong that's been dealt us, so will he. And if
Right.
I can somehow find a way to be bigger than that, so will he.
Yeah, and I think that that just speaks. I mean, it was a beautiful moment that she talked about, and she talks, about having all of these feelings, which I think is really important, of, loss and sadness and anger and confusion, and experiencing all of those, and then getting to a place where she felt empathy and compassion for the young boy who had taken her son's life. And when she spoke about that, it was
Astonishing.
a really, incredible thing for her to be talking about, because to lose your son at such a young age to such a violent act, and then to get to a place of having empathy and compassion for the young boy who did that. And her whole mission is spreading the awareness and importance of social and emotional learning, because of the message um, that her son Jesse left on their chalkboard as his final message, which was nurturing, healing, love. And she came to a place of realizing that if the young boy who took her son's life had had nurturing, healing, love, he would not have gone to school with a gun that day and killed those children. And so she's dedicated her entire life to teaching children about social emotional learning all across the world, all across the country. And she's such an inspiring and incredible woman. And she has really, um, her whole forgiveness journey, and the way she speaks about forgiveness and having empathy and compassion, I think for majority of parents, they look at that and they just wonder how.
I mean, it is so advanced. That is so
Mhm.
advanced in terms of like emotional processing. And as you say, which I think is a really good note to underline for people listening, that forgiveness doesn't mean that you didn't feel and aren't feeling the
Mhm.
whole rainbow of emotions.
Or
They're
won't ever feel it again.
so devastated, so heartbroken, so wronged, so angry. Like all of that is not washed away.
Mhm.
It's just something that you have to move past eventually, lest you live there forever. Like my cousin Kathy's son was killed in a car accident when the summer after his freshman year in college. And she said, for 10 years, I said, why did that happen? And he
Mhm.
wasn't driving. It was another kid. She was nervous about him going out. The woods were wet. They were going to a party. And then she finally got to like, it happened because it can. Like a car can skid out on wet leaves and hit a tree, and it can
Right.
flip over, and metal can pierce, and glass can break. And this is not anybody's fault.
Mhm.
And to get there as quickly as Scarlett Lewis did, and to take all that energy and reshape it into something so positive and I think probably deeply effective. Like, what a great thing to do in a post Sandy Hook moment. You could either fight for gun control reform, God help us all if we ever get that passed, or
Yeah.
you can address the underlying issue of who is this kid that did this and why and what did they need that they didn't get. And she says something in that chapter very quickly about, who must he be? It says, I remember right off the bat, thinking that whoever could do something so horrendous must have been in a tremendous amount of pain.
Mhm.
I mean, that's advanced.
Very. Yeah, and I
Uh,
think it's also, it's important to note that whatever the situation is that anybody is going through, that that this is Scarlett's way of having dealt with her tragedy, and then there are other people who deal with it in their own way, or your cousin who took 10 years to get to a place of moving on past it, and that it doesn't mean that once she practiced forgiveness or was able to forgive, that she never have had moments of trigger moments of feeling sadness or anger ever again, because she did. But it was all about how you bring yourself back to getting to that place and that choice of forgiveness.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a really good thing to add to the conversation so that people don't feel like failure, forgiveness flops.
Yeah.
Like, because you could. She's so amazed. There's so many people in this who feel so far beyond what I personally am capable of.
Yeah.
But it's very kind of you to remind us that
Well,
it
I,
doesn't
I
lose
like
steam,
to,
and you have to reapproach and you have to like recommit to the cause.
yeah, I like to also, point out that the 22 people in this book, their stories are, incredibly inspiring and just remarkable stories of forgiveness in all different forms, and some people who are still struggling with forgiveness. Um, my goal with this book is to inspire people to welcome forgiveness into their lives, and also to learn from the 22 people in this book's forgiveness journey, to inspire you to welcome forgiveness into your life. It's never to compare each other's hurt, because I don't think anything good comes from that. And
Good.
that's never the goal of my book at all. And I don't think that it's a good habit to get in general, just in life, is my
Mm.
hurt is worse than your hurt's worse than my hurt, because everybody's hurt is their own hurt, and it is the biggest thing in the world to them. And so it's never I never like, when someone comes to me and says like, oh my god, well, what they experienced was so much worse than what I experienced, and like my thing is nothing. And I'm like, if you feel that way, that's okay. But also, if you feel like what someone in this book experienced was so terrible, and it inspires you to welcome forgiveness into your life, that's great. But also, let yourself own the hurt that you experienced and that you have in your life, because it's very real. And this is never to discredit the hurt that you've experienced. It's just to inspire you to see how forgiveness has changed these people's lives dramatically and also has had a ripple effect on changing other people around their lives.
Yeah.
And will hopefully make the forgiveness journey for readers and people who are listening or reading, uh, to look at forgiveness in a different way that could make their lives much more free from
Mhm.
carrying around anger.
It's interesting that thing about like tragedy comparing, or like, oh, they have it so much worse, or I have it so much worse, or the kind of contest that sometimes people have. And I think about it right now with COVID,
Mhm,
because I have there's so many ways that you could be suffering right now.
mhm,
Like, you could have a parent who has it, you could have someone in your family who has it, you could be far away from someone who has it, you could have just lost your job, your husband could have just lost his job, et cetera, et cetera. And it's hard sometimes to feel comfortable saying, like, I had such a shitty day, like I felt so down all day long, and I don't have any of the problems I just listed.
mhm,
And so it's also, I think, very compassionate of you to make this note that, like, your feelings are your feelings,
mhm,
and there's really no sense in denying them. You might as well let them in, feel them out, and keep moving. But
mhm.
there's no point in saying, well, that person has it so much worse, I don't know I don't know what I'm crying
Yeah.
about. So the next person I wanted you to tell us about, you said that probably the most difficult story to take in was the story of Adele.
Yeah.
Tell everybody about her and what she had to forgive.
Adele's a man,
Oh, sorry.
and he is a incredibly inspiring man that I actually met because he is friendly with my husband, and I had met him one or two times, and I had heard about his story, but I wanted to know more about it, and just out of curiosity. And then also he had said to somebody that he had forgiven, and so his story is an incredibly graphic and gruesome story of a crazy series of events. And he he's had, if you read his story and just look at his life, it's kind of one thing after another for
Mhm.
him, and one tragedy after another. And he's so inspiring the way that he speaks about his experience and looking back on very challenging and tragic times, and having forgiveness in his heart for people who have wronged him. And I think that that's really inspiring because he is now in America and he has a career as a fighter, and he does that professionally. And
MMA fighter, right?
correct, yeah, an MMA fighter. And he just has such a big heart, and you could look at how he the way that he could have gone, which is anger, rage, you know, just for losing so many people in his life. And he came to America and just, made the most of his situation. And the way that when I sat down and talked to him, he came over to our house and I sat down and talked to him. And it was one of those conversations that I had where I went back and I had to kept going back, and I said, wait, so you really forgive them? How do you forgive them? I mean, you watched terrible things happen. Like his brother was shot in the face and lost his eyesight and his nose. And he said, I forgive them because I don't want to take on that anger. And I don't want to have anything to do with that negativity. And it was just and he has so many more wild things that have happened to him that are in his section of the book. But he just spoke about forgiveness and what it meant to him growing up. And, I also have found culturally forgiveness to be really interesting as well. And he was another person that I talked to who, spoke about the cultural differences with how you learn about forgiveness growing up. And and that's also really interesting to me. And so he's somebody who's a bright light of just the biggest heart in the world, and just has welcomed forgiveness into his life in order to be the person and the man that he is today. And he speaks about it so beautifully. So I really am really just lucky that he shared his story in my book.
He's like a practitioner. Like he's a
Yeah.
habitual forgiver. Like that,
Yes.
you know what I mean? I mean,
Mhm.
unfortunately, has so much to work through.
Right.
Um, so the book ends on a father-son story, and it's Pablo Escobar's son.
Yes. Sebastian Marroquin.
So tell us about talking to him.
So he was actually my final interview. and and he was an incredible person to talk to because I I did some research. I found him online. I reached out to him, and he doesn't live in
So
America.
gutsy of you. It
my
really
mom
is.
always my mom always said that the worst thing that can happen when you reach out to somebody is that they say no and you move on and everything is fine again.
Wise
So
woman.
yeah. So I had that mentality when going into do this book, because also it was the only way that the book would get done in the format that I had envisioned for it. So I think us in America, we've watched shows on Pablo Escobar, we've read about him, we've learned about him, and and to to talk to his son uh, about humanizing him and talking about him and what it was like to have him as a father was fascinating to me. And I remember I emailed him and we went back and forth on times, and he was traveling a little bit, and he's not actually allowed in America. And he was in Colombia, and I talked to him, not really again knowing what to expect when you had a father like Pablo Escobar, and knowing the amount of tragedy that his father had caused in so many innocent people's lives, and also the life that his father left for him, and his mom and his other siblings. So it was, it could have gone a lot of different angles. And the way that he spoke about his father was, it not only humanized the figure of Pablo Escobar for me as someone who has learned about him and watched shows about him, but it was the way he spoke about him was so beautiful. And the way that he said, I never questioned my father's love for me. My dad loved me. He, loved our family. He protected our family. And to me, he was just my dad. And I know that what he talked about, knowing that what his father was doing when he was younger, he knew that it was wrong and asked him to stop.
Mm.
Um, but he never had anger or rage at his father for putting him in the situations that he was in as a child, which is incredible. And he also said, I'm going to not say this exactly correct, but he talked about it not being his responsibility or his role to judge his father, and that's only God's role. And that was really interesting to me, because I think there are so many people, and I found this with doing this book and just leading up to this book, a lot of people who have extremely complicated relationships with family members, parents, for a variety of different reasons. And the way he spoke about viewing his father as just his father was really beautiful and really interesting to me. And then to see what he's done with his life since losing his dad, which is that he has really dedicated his entire life and his entire being to going to all the victims of his father and asking for forgiveness on behalf of his father.
Mm.
And that, to me, when he told me that I know that he had done a documentary on his dad, and that he talked a lot about this mission that he had for his life, but to take on the amount of victims, families that his father had left here, and to choose to make it your life mission to go to each family member that was affected by his father's tragedies, which we know is a lot. Um, and to make that your goal, to go to them and ask for forgiveness when he didn't need to do that at all, because that's his father's, you
Right.
know,
Right.
life. But he decided to do that. And I said to him, well, how many people have said that they forgive you? And he said 100%, all of them have said that they've forgiven me. And I just remember thinking, just like, oh my God, if this man is going to each person, which is such an incredible decision to be able to even want to do that as a young man. And then, it's not like his dad's alive and he can go and say to his dad, I this person forgave you. He's just doing it in honor of his dad, but also to do right by, all of the people who were affected. And then also to change the vibe of Colombia,
Yeah.
and to welcome forgiveness into Colombia and talk about forgiveness in a place where that is not had not been talked about. And so I think he was such a fascinating person to talk to, and you could tell just had a really beautiful heart, and an amazing young man, 100% just
Yeah.
amazing.
Well, it was a super strong finish to the book. I was thinking when I was reading it about the law of Gachacha in Rwanda, like how they had, after the genocide, they had
Yes.
800,000 war crimes or something to process. And Paul Kagame, who was the president, came up with this way for people to process them in this law of Gachacha, which is like the law of the grass hill, where a person who was charged with perpetrating genocide would say in front of a community, eyeball to eyeball, to the member of the family, I killed your sister, I killed your mother, I put their bodies here, I raped them, I was wrong, will you forgive me?
Mhm.
And if they could do that, then the other person had a total option to say, no, I do not. I do not forgive you, or I do not forgive you yet. But if they were able to reach some kind of moment of forgiveness, it healed the whole community. They got a lesser sentence, like they still went to jail, but it reduced their jail time, and it created the potential for like a thriving community, which is what you're saying about Pablo Escobar's son, is that he's creating the potential for Colombia to heal.
Yeah, and it also, it shows really beautifully, and there are plenty of stories in my book that talk about how one person's choice to forgive, or to dedicate their life to forgiveness, or to talk about forgiveness, the ripple effects that it has on people around them, whether it's, a country or a small group of people or a family member or whatever it is, that you never know what one person's act of forgiveness, how that can affect those around them.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of different examples in this book of one person making a decision to forgive, and it changing not only the course of their lives and whoever the person was that was involved, but also the lives of so many people around them. And when you're talking about the Rwandan genocide, one of the people in the book that I interviewed is Immaculée Ilibagiza, and she was her family was killed in the Rwandan genocide, and she talked about going to meet the person who was a family friend of hers who killed her whole family, and telling him across the table that she forgave him. And her story is incredible and so remarkable. But these are all examples of how someone's decision to forgive not only affects their life because it's a gift that they've given themselves, but it is also a gift that, when they decide to give to themselves, really does have a ripple effect on those around them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a few questions from our online audience. James Driscoll asked, is forgiving family easier or harder?
That's funny that, not funny, but it's an interesting question, because so I have this Facebook uh, group that we started prior to the book coming out called Forgiveness Ambassadors. And it was really a Facebook group that we started just to kind of start the conversation around forgiveness ahead of the book coming out, and see, how people would talk about it, and engage around the topic of forgiveness. And I would say majority of the questions that have come up in that Facebook group and also just in general at book signings that I've done and just events that I've been able to talk to people at is forgiveness of family members and how hard that is, not only because of your closeness to a family member and being hurt by a family member, but also because you can't, for a lot of people, necessarily eliminate them from your life and not have interactions with them ever again in order to heal and give yourself time to heal. So I think
Yes, and
forgiveness
everyone's
is
watching. Yeah, that's the other thing. Like in a family, if two people are mad at each other,
right.
then the other people are like, "What
Yeah.
you, what you gonna do?" Like
Who's gonna fold first? Yeah.
exactly. And there's so much
So
pressure to not blow up the harmony of a family. And
yeah. I think that like obviously every single person's family forgiveness story is different and unique and very complicated, of course. The one thing that I'll say is a big topic that we've talked about in this Facebook group is just implementing boundaries, healthy boundaries where you can when it comes to your healing process, and also um, understanding that if something happens in a relationship, accepting that maybe your relationship might not go back to what it was before, and if you choose to have the person in your life still as a regular person or regular figure, that you are okay with understanding that you know implementing new boundaries that protect you and your heart moving forward, while they're so hard to do, especially with family, it's okay to do that, and it's oftentimes probably more realistic than thinking in your head you can eliminate them from your life altogether. There are, of course, a lot of people who don't speak to their family members, and that's totally their choice, but I think for a lot of people it's always the question of, how am I supposed to have Thanksgiving or have holiday time, or interact at family functions with somebody who has hurt me so deeply? And that's I think that's a really tough thing to do, and obviously when you are close to the person as a family member or a close friend or whatever the situation is, I think that makes forgiveness and the forgiveness journey obviously that much more complicated.
yeah, I mean, it's funny. There's another question here from Nicole Deweese that says, if you have children, what would you want to teach them about forgiveness? And when I was listening to you, I was thinking about, I'm a mom of two teenage girls, and obviously everybody with families is just face to face with them nonstop right now.
Yeah.
There is it does sort of take like leadership from somebody in a family to teach you that like there's a way to not roll over, not set yourself up for more pain,
Mhm.
but decide to let go of something, to decide to forgive something and still set boundaries. And like, as you say, it's so complex that I wonder, is your mom a good teacher in this area? Is your dad a good teacher? It's like, to, how did you learn to be forgiving, and what would you want to teach your kids? You don't have kids yet, do you?
No,
Yeah.
I have a stepson. I do not have my own children yet. But I've always loved kids, and having a stepson is like the most fun thing ever.
Yeah.
So, just I think having, when it comes to what I would teach my children about forgiveness, uh, I talked to Cora Jakes Coleman, who's in my book, and she spoke a lot about how she's teaching her two young children about forgiveness at a very early age. And she's talked about teaching her children the difference between saying I'm sorry versus I apologize, and the importance at a very early age, for kids to be aware of the power of I apologize, and being held accountable for their actions, acknowledging the hurt that they've caused, and also and making the decision to not want to cause that kind of hurt or pain again. And so I think that that's a really great way to teach young children about forgiveness. And then I think as kids get older, or people get older, that seems to be where it seems like a more complicated, and I'm sure you deal with this with your teenagers, that it seems to be that that's when forgiveness changes from being very simple and easy as a child to then
Right, like, "You took
saying,
my candy, who cares?"
yeah, you like didn't include me on the playground or whatever it is. And then, when you get older and there are more emotions and things
And
involved in
history, the
forgiveness. e-
complexity of the history.
Exactly. So I think just keeping the conversation open around forgiveness is what I intend on doing, and being able to just be open about what the definition of forgiveness changing, how we practice it, how we struggle with it, being really open about that. And I learned about forgiveness. My mom is obviously an incredible teacher in all areas of life and with forgiveness as well. And she always, was really open with us for kids about how she felt about certain things in life, and knowing that how we were feeling was okay, how she feels is okay, how another kid's feeling is okay, and how everyone's feelings are valid and okay. And always, also, both of my parents created an environment for us kids at a very early age of just being really non-judgmental. And so I think that that allowed conversations like a conversation about forgiveness or curiosity around the topic of forgiveness to be something that we would feel comfortable talking to them about, because we didn't feel judged or criticized about, you know, asking those kinds of questions or struggling with something or wanting to learn more. So I think that, having that kind of environment is a blessing for teenagers and also just kids as we get older in general. And I think my parents did a very good job at that.
Yeah. My big thing around here is, talking about the difference between saying, I'm sorry and I was wrong.
Yeah,
And I feel like saying I was wrong is, like, so deeply humble. Like, that is steeped in humility, and
totally.
it's
Yeah,
so unequivocal.
yeah,
And what I think is behind it, the healing the potential for healing is that what I'm saying if I say I was wrong is that you and I actually agree. We have the same worldview. And in
right.
both of our worldviews, that kind of behavior is wrong.
Hmm.
And I did it. I wish I didn't do it. And I agree with you that it was wrong. And
Right.
agreement is so hard to come by sometimes in families. So
Yes.
anyway, let me get to a few more questions before we have to go. Alyssa Broad said, "What is the hardest thing you have had to overcome? How did you find forgiveness?"
Well, I think just, probably I would say that falling out with my friend that I was talking about at the
Yeah.
beginning of this conversation and that I opened with talking about in my book was something that was really challenging and that took me many years to get to a place where I eliminated that anxiety and nervousness and frustration with myself in the process. And I think one of the things that I also learned very quickly with doing this book and talking to 22 people is that there's no timetable on forgiveness. And that was really a relief for me to hear, because I think so many of us, we have something happen in our lives and we want to hurry up and forgive just to get over it and move past it and move on with our lives. And I was talking to Chris Williams earlier today, who's also in my
Mm,
book and has an incredible
amazing.
story. Yeah. And he said that when he was told the advice of being patient and that forgiveness takes patience, he did not like hearing it
Mhm.
when he was told. But he now tells people that piece of advice because it's so true about forgiveness, is that it's requires patience, it requires time, and that can be really challenging for all of us. And I know that it was really challenging for me, whether it was, with my friend or just in a variety of different situations in life. It's like you want to speed up the process on just moving past something, and it's like, you have to take your time, and everyone's time is unique and specific to their situation. And I think that's encouraging to people who feel like they've been stuck in a situation for a long time.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more. And it's kind of interesting. It's almost like a technical question, which is from Neil Grimmond. And it says, can you forgive someone and still cut them out of your life? How do you explain that complicated idea to the person you're cutting out?
So I love this question because this is something that that I had asked myself in my own life, and then asked. It was a question that I actually asked a lot of the people that I interviewed for this book, and that was, if you choose to cut someone out of your life and say that you forgave them, is that really forgiveness, or is that eliminating someone from your life for convenience purposes, and you still have resentment clearly towards them because you don't want them in your life any longer? And it was amazing to hear that every single person pretty much said that if you choose to cut someone out of your life, that doesn't mean that you haven't forgiven them. Bless you.
Thank you.
Doesn't mean that you haven't forgiven them. It means that you have forgiven them, but you don't want to have dinner with them. And that's okay. And that, to me, was something that I myself was struggling with, because when I was having this falling out with my friend, I oftentimes would think, well, if I have forgiven this person, then why can't I go to lunch with this person, or why can't I go hang out with this person again? And everybody told me that I talked to, you can forgive someone and choose, out of boundaries for yourself and to protect your own heart and to protect yourself moving forward, you can choose to not have them in your life now or ever again, and that's okay. It has nothing to do with your forgiveness journey. It's all about how you choose to protect yourself moving forward. And so, to answer the question, if if you choose to forgive someone and to cut them out of your life, that does not mean that you have not forgiven them or done the work to forgive them. It means that you have probably forgiven them, but you also want to be mindful of your boundaries and your heart and your life moving forward, and also protecting yourself so maybe that same pattern doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
And that was a big relief for me to hear, because I think we all know when we've forgiven someone a little bit, like, and even if we think that we've forgiven them and then we hear the person's name, or we might run into the person accidentally and we still have that anxiety feeling, then we realize, like, maybe I should go back and practice forgiveness a little bit more.
Yeah.
And then I'm not totally done there. And that takes time. But I think that it's totally, your call and okay to choose to not have someone in your life any longer in order to protect yourself moving forward.
Yeah, I really agree. Okay, it is an Inforum tradition to ask all our speakers the following question. What is your 60-second idea to change the world?
Right now, my 60-second
Right.
idea
60
would
seconds.
be for everybody to stay home. That's like
That is the
my
right.
biggest it's not my idea, but I would say that we can see how much of an impact everybody staying home right now is making on this whole spread of coronavirus. And while it is incredibly challenging for so many people, and obviously there are a huge amount of people who cannot stay home and that are working at grocery stores and in emergency rooms and in hospitals to keep us all safe, that we're staying home so everybody can do their job and put an end to the spread of this crazy virus as quickly as possible. And it's for safety. And so my advice for a better world is stay home.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us
Thank
today
you so
here at
much.
Forum at the Commonwealth Club. Copies of Catherine's book are available for purchase at your local independent bookstore or barnesandnoble.com. If you'd like to watch more virtual programming or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual programming, please visit inforumsf.org/give. I'm Kelly Corrigan. Thank you and good night. Bye, guys. Thanks for coming.